author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special show, we are talking all things 2024 election, from the Democratic Party palace coup, whether Kamala Harris can be unburdened from her own record, how the Trump campaign has to pivot to deal with a new candidate, and why the 2024 polling situation just got a whole lot more interesting. Remember, this show is sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access breaking news, podcasts, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. With Vice President Kamala Harris taking the reins of the Democrat nomination at the moment, what does this mean for democracy in America? And there's a whole host of wild and woolly questions that do need to be answered about what some people are calling a palace coup. We're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, who's going to help us sort the fact from the fiction. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Hello, Mark.
So, Tim, let's start with the one that really must be burning in the hearts of people who voted in a primary for Joe Biden to be their presidential nominee. How democratic is the Democratic Party being by essentially anointing Kamala Harris?
Well, there's two sides to that coin. The first side is what you said, that 13 million Democrats voted for Joe Biden in the primary. But the other side of the coin is that they were given no choice. The party elites, the elders, the donors, the people that are calling the shots in the Democratic Party. There's no question that they made the decision who the one and only candidate was going to be, and the Democratic rank and file went along with it. Now, after making that tragic mistake of putting Joe Biden at the top of the ticket, when, as we've since found out, and since we pretty much knew all along, that he wasn't up to the job of running again, and possibly not even to being commander-in-chief, right? These things became obvious, and he was forced out in a palace coup that was again led by who? The party elites: Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer. And so what they said then was, we only gave you this choice, but never mind. Now we're giving you only one other choice, and we're going to ram it down your throats the same way we did Joe Biden. And so the question, if I'm a Democrat, is if there was the kind of open primary that there should have been if Joe Biden had dropped out like he should have, could Kamala Harris have beaten out all these rising stars we're talking about in the party, like Gretchen Whitmer and Gavin Newsom and Josh Shapiro and Roy Cooper and all these guys that now are being asked to accept the second spot, one of them, on a ticket that nobody wanted, nobody expected, and that Democratic voters themselves were given no choice but to accept.
It's almost a cold irony, isn't it? The name of the party and the process by which they inflicted candidates.
The contrast to the Republicans, because, look, one of the most prominent narratives that was advanced in the early days of this campaign was that the voters didn't want Joe Biden or Donald Trump on the ballot. They wanted alternatives. They wanted other candidates, other choices. So while the Democrats said, nah, we're going to ride with Biden, the Republicans said, okay, the data is baked in, that people have a prevailing negative view of Donald Trump. So what are we going to do about this? So they held a primary process that was legitimate, that attracted other attractive candidates, alternatives to Trump, like Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley. Okay, Trump still wiped the floor with him, but the point was that there was an affirmation by the Republican rank and file of the unity that we now see. He won the primaries fair and square in a competitive process against other strong candidates. The result, the party is united, while the Democrats completely fractured and in chaos.
So it's not yet official that she is the nominee because they still have
Pretty much, though.
Sure. AP News ran an informal delegate count last week, informal delegate survey where they racked up and said that she does have more than enough to go.
Right.
And that will probably happen.
In the space of 24 hours.
It's almost as though they started before.
Oh, well, certainly you're not suggesting that they were considering a Biden withdrawal before he actually withdrew. But look, I think there's an early perception that, Kamala Harris will have a mini honeymoon here. She'll be glamorized. She'll be lifted up to be the female Barack Obama. She's going to be a rock star. She's going to be all over social media with a lot of hip, cool stuff. Her polls will climb, and we'll talk about that later. Her polls will climb temporarily. But it's what happens next when they really look at her record. It's going to be frightening.
And we're going to come back and examine that record after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Once again, we're joined by Liberty Nation, longtime host of this here radio show and senior political analyst Tim Donner. Earlier in the show, we were talking about the conducted palace coup that took place in the Democratic Party. And we just started broaching the subject there, Tim, hadn't we, of Kamala Harris's record. And I think it's notable that her very first campaign performance as let's call her what she's, the presumptive nominee here. The very first campaign performance, she talked a lot, and she talked a lot about her record as a prosecutor, her record in California, and all these things that she'd done before she became vice president. Notably absent from that was anything that has happened since she became vice president. Now, why would you think that is, Tim?
Well,
I know it's a fairly obvious answer, I guess.
But in fairness to Vice President Harris, most vice presidents get shunted aside, especially when they're picked for one purpose, which is the race and gender that was necessary for the look they needed for 2020. I think everybody just assumed, and rightfully so, that once she had fulfilled her purpose, she would be shunted aside or worse. And it was worse because what she was asked to be in charge of was a border that had just become completely porous because of the overturning of every Trump policy. So they said, let's pin it on her. Let's let her be responsible. Now, Mark, that's not the mark of a party or a president who is trying to elevate or lift up his vice president. You don't give her tasks that are impossible to achieve given your own policies. And then you slap the label of root causes, that she's going to examine the root causes, so that we were expected to believe that she would penetrate the highest levels of the governments of Central and South America and persuade them to whatever it is they're doing. Stop. Stop. That's the root cause. Okay, so it became a laugh line along with Kamala herself. And she's going to get a honeymoon. The left is doing all they can to toe the line between her claims of being a tough on crime prosecutor and being a progressive, radical warrior whose record in supporting in in fact, in championing the Green New Deal, in supporting radically higher taxes on corporations. The list go on and on. And eventually it's going to come down to her record. So in my piece on libertynation.com on Wednesday morning, what I laid out was a series of questions she's going to have to answer before anybody takes her seriously as a potential commander-in-chief. And the first question, Mark, is, when were you aware of President Biden's cognitive decline? What did you do about it? What did you say about it? Who did you talk to about it? Will you still claim that you saw no evidence of his deteriorating condition through all of your interactions with him, including your weekly lunches? Congressional Democrats, it's now come out in the Wall Street Journal, Axios, and other places, that congressional Democrats were startled by Joe Biden's cognitive condition as early as the fall of 2021. That's 3 years ago. Now, Ms. Harris, Ms. Vice President, if President Biden is not up to running for office, something, by the way, he denied for months before admitting that he wasn't, how exactly is he fit to continue as commander-in-chief? What's your response right now to Robert Hur's description of your president as an elderly man with a poor memory? Okay, that's just for starters, Mark. She's going to have to answer all of those questions once her little mini honeymoon here is over and the adulation and glory of the Democratic convention gives her a little bit of a bump in the polls. Then we get down to the nitty-gritty of answering those questions.
Yeah, there are questions that can be campaign killers, I think, because the wrong answer on that, you're either saying that you are willing to put the United States at risk because of your compassionate heart, and you are willing to lie to the American people because you're so empathetic about Joe Biden's plight, or you were trying to secure your own power base, which makes you essentially quite evil to continue to push a candidate who is suffering such obvious cognitive issues, and yet you want to stay in power so much.
Do you know how easy it is going to be for Republicans to run down the sound bites of Kamala Harris saying Joe Biden is vigorous and young and runs circles around us, sharp as a tack, all of this stuff? They'll just pull out one after another and run them back to back to back. But that's just a matter of this palace coup and the whole process of how Biden was forced onto the voters and then pulled back and then had her forced onto the voters, whether they like her or not. Here's another one she's going to have to answer in terms of policy, for starters, and it's obvious. As border czar in the Biden administration, though you tend to reject that title, how much responsibility, Madam Vice President, are you willing to accept for the catastrophe at the southern border, for the millions of illegal immigrants who poured over the border since the advent of your administration and the reversal of Trump immigration policies? Here's another good one. Do you agree that inflation was really 9% when you took office, as the president has repeatedly claimed, even though it was reported by the actual authoritative agency, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, as 1.4%? And exactly how much responsibility are you willing to accept for inflation that's worse than at any time in 40 years, and rising prices that are forcing Americans to change their lifestyles? How about it, Madam Vice President? Now, again, if she can pass the bar and handle the answers to those questions with some force and some credibility, then she has the opportunity to change her image. But if she answers the way she always has, with her signature word salads, with her cackles that are so embarrassing and cringeworthy, with her circular logic, she is going to reinforce that image. And I think it's possible, Mark, that in the end, she could experience a Michael Dukakis style decline. And what I mean is that in 1988, when Michael Dukakis left the Democratic Convention, he led by 17 points over George Bush, and he lost the election overwhelmingly. That's a lesson for Ms. Harris.
Very much so. Very much so. I should call up on one thing that you said there, Tim, because you're in danger of being labeled a right-wing conspiracist for calling Ms. Harris the border czar, because according to Axios this week, this is just something that is only ever said in right-wing circles as an attempt to attack the vice president. Now,
if they didn't do that,
if I may, Tim, if I may, all you have to do is go into the search bar on Axios's website and type border czar to find out that apparently they were also right-wing conspiracists, because they called her the border czar on numerous occasions. So that's something she's going to try and avoid.
Everything that the progressive media has tried to depict about her over the years, which they've gotten away with because she was a vice president, and okay, she was a butt of jokes. She was fun to make fun of and stuff, but nobody really took her seriously, honestly. Nobody thought that when push came to shove that the Democrats would allow her to be the face of the Democratic Party. But here we are. It's a crisis of their own making that they're trying to put a good face on. They're trying to act like now we have the progressive woman of color, although they try not to use the term progressive. But that's what she is. She is the most radical candidate ever to run for president, bar none. In fact, it's not even close. You want to talk about a female Barack Obama. Barack Obama looks like a right-winger compared to her. In fact, George McGovern, I remember in 1972 when he ran against Richard Nixon, who was seeking re-election, and McGovern dared to propose that the government give $1,000 a year to every person in the country to stimulate the economy. Well, that was such a scandal. And now you look at what Kamala Harris wants to do, which is to take that branch and grow it into a massive progressive tree.
It will have to be a money tree for that kind of thing to work, I think, Tim. We're going to be back with Tim after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're joined once again by longtime host of this here show, Mr. Tim Donner, who happens to be Liberty Nation's senior political analyst. Now, earlier in the show, we were talking about the palace coup, the Kamala conundrum. Now, Tim, I want to move on to more what's happening with former President Donald Trump and how his campaign is going to pivot to deal with Kamala Harris rather than Joe Biden, because it seems to me the battle lines of electioneering were quite clear for Joe Biden. He's lost his marbles, is essentially the campaign they were running. Now, that's not true of Kamala Harris, although she does have her own problems. So I really want to talk about how they're retooling the Trump campaign to deal with a different candidate. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the Trump campaign has claimed for a while, and I've tended to agree with this assessment that they don't really care whether they face Biden or Harris, that it's still the Biden-Harris administration. It's the Biden-Harris record. It's the Biden-Harris border, the Biden-Harris crime, the Biden-Harris foreign policy with two ground wars running wild and the world on fire. So at one level, they see the challenge as the same. On the other level, on another level, there's several levels to this, but on another level, they now have someone who's capable of hitting back. They now have someone who's pretty well spoken when she's not cackling or in the midst of one of her word salads. She's attractive. She can read a speech well. She has the look of someone who is kind of a little bit of everything, right? And there's the question. She seems sort of white, sort of black, sort of Indian, sort of Jamaican, sort of a little bit of everything. And that begs the question, as she tries to be everything to everybody, will she wind up being nothing to nobody, as she did in her own presidential campaign, which face planted before it ever even made it to the starting line of the first contest? That's how incredibly poor candidate she was. On the other hand, Joe Biden face planted in 1988, and he face planted in 2008, and he wound up in the Oval Office somehow. So you can't discount it. But I think that the pivot now is to Joe Biden, who was a liberal and bowed to the will of the progressives, to Kamala Harris, who's a dyed in the wool progressive through and through. Her instincts, her heart, her mind is progressive, even though when it came to elections as district attorney in San Francisco, as attorney general of California, she created the impression that she was tough on crime. But she completely wiped that out, Mark, with one of the occasions that's really going to get brought up against her, which is in 2020, in the summer from hell, when riots were breaking out across the land. You know, dozens were murdered, property damage was in the billions. She gave directly to a fund to release the rioters. And as you know, there weren't that many rioters that were actually locked up, only the worst of the bunch. And she helped get them out. So that showed where her heart really is. So this idea that she's tough on crime, I don't think it's going to fly. And I think the Democrats will, I think the Republicans, I should say, and Trump will mock the idea that she's anything but a dyed-in-the-wool radical progressive. They couldn't quite make that claim against Joe Biden.
Yeah, good point. But it does seem that this thing about the bailing out of the BLM rioters, her incarceration of numerous black men in California for marijuana use, and then joking about her own marijuana use on a radio show. Her word salads, as you point out, during the debate where Tulsi Gabbard utterly destroyed her campaign, just listing off the various things that were liabilities to Kamala, the candidate in 2020. And these videos, they're just resurfacing. And it seems that the internet is essentially running Donald Trump's campaign for him, because for every almost sycophant that was backing Joe Biden as the only one who can beat Donald Trump and is now, Kamala Harris is going to beat Donald Trump. For every one of those videos that's coming out, one of those posts that's coming out, there's 3 or 4 of Kamala Harris's own words coming back to haunt her. And I think that's she should try and become unburdened by what has been.
Well, not to mention the laugh reel that they'll be able to easily compile of all the times she broke into that hysterical hyena-like cackle at times where a graceful smile was appropriate. It's just a creepy kind of a personality quirk or personality defining element, it's another thing she's going to have to overcome. And look, I think that Kamala Harris can probably be pretty effective on offense. But so is Joe Biden. He attacked Donald Trump endlessly. That's the easiest thing in the world, to call him a fascist, a dictator, an authoritarian, the end of democracy. I mean, anybody can do that. Any Democrat can do that. The question is, how does she handle the hard questions about herself, her record, and her beliefs? Because that's what it's going to come down to when she debates Donald Trump. How will she handle the withering questioning of Donald Trump in the debates ahead? And we haven't even touched on the dynamics of a debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, except to say, Mark, like everything else in this election, the debate meltdown, the assassination attempt, the Biden withdrawal, we're in uncharted territory, entirely uncharted territory. And concluding with the fact that no party has ever swapped out its presidential candidate this late in the presidential campaign.
Yes, it's what is it, 0 days since our last historical once-in-a-lifetime event. We need a sign on the wall for it. So there's a couple of side elements that I want to talk about relative to the Trump campaign and what's happening from the Republican side. So at the moment, there is a challenge being brought forward to impeach Kamala Harris. Now, this is probably not going anywhere. The two articles, one is her failure on the border. The other one is for her failure to invoke the 25th Amendment against Joe Biden. Now, I don't feel that this is going to go anywhere because there probably isn't the support for it this close to an election. But it's quite damaging, isn't it? As you pointed out earlier, there are questions that she has to answer. And one of those is why, when it was so clear about Joe Biden's cognitive decline, didn't she do her duty and follow the 25th Amendment path?
Well, this is clearly a political theatrics designed to embarrass Kamala Harris and to bring the issue into the news to whatever extent it can. I mean, the right-wing media will cover it, the left-wing media won't, and the ones in the middle, that'll probably determine whether the substance of the impeachment inquiry is legitimate or not. But the issues will be brought up. If they're not brought up in the framework of an impeachment inquiry, they certainly will be brought up by Donald Trump and the Trump campaign prominently.
Yeah, another aspect of what the Trump campaign's doing is that I believe they've launched a lawsuit saying that you can't just take the $100 million that donors have given in good faith and then switch the name at the top of the ticket.
Well, you can and you can't. It's a complicated process. And, there'll be some attention to that. But the fact that it's $91 million, look, to you and me, that's a princely sum. But to a presidential campaign that expects to raise in the billions, it's not going to be a defining issue. She got $100 million of pent-up contributions, because let's not forget what a lot of people think, and there's perfectly legitimate reason to say it, that it was really the Democratic donors that led this palace coup, the big donors, the mega donors who said, hey, until you get the old man out, you get nothing from me. And now eventually they got the old man out, and the money that was waiting at the starting gate, they just opened the door and it came flooding in. But we'll see how the fundraising goes from here, because again, another unprecedented historical event, just as we're trying to process all the rest of it.
And we'll continue with those historical, unprecedented events, the next one in line after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're joined once again by Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Tim Donner. We've been running the gamut on pretty much every angle you can consider for the 2024 election, except polling. And Tim, polling, you and I, we love our old Real Clear Politics. We love delving deep into the numbers. Now, polling's a bit tricky this early in the game because although the polls exist that do Donald Trump and Kamala Harris in a head-to-head matchup, most of them were before she became the presumable nominee. Although there have been a few since Joe Biden stepped down from running. And I think they're quite interesting. What's your take on it?
Well, Mark, I think one of the overlooked things about this, and it's someone who ran for the United States Senate, this kind of thing is something I had to pay attention to. But think about the thousands, perhaps millions of lawn signs across the country saying Biden-Harris. Think about all the placards, the advertisements, all of the things that have to immediately be pulled down and replaced. And they can't even do that because they don't even have a vice presidential candidate yet. So, I mean, the pivot has to be enormous. And that's also true with the pollsters, because it's one thing to poll a projected race between Trump and Harris. It's another thing to take the polling after the huge bump that Trump got from the convention or that Harris got from her elevation to the presidential ticket and the glamorization of her by the media together with Hollywood. But it's quite another thing to look at the polls once all of this settles in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe not even till really the fall, because now you've got this sudden and shocking change in the Democratic ticket. You've got them scrambling to pivot, and you've got the Democratic convention coming up in mid-August. And that'll give her probably some kind of bump if they run things effectively. And they're able to silence the inevitable radical anti-Israeli, largely anti-American protests scheduled for the Democratic convention. But once we get to Labor Day, the rubber hits the road, and we're probably going to have at least 2 debates between Trump and Harris. And really, in my opinion, Mark, it's not till then that we can look too seriously at the polls again, with a whole warning about Michael Dukakis, who left the convention in 1988 up 17 and lost by 8 points. That's a 25-point swing in about 3 months.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. We're a little far out for what's essentially a brand new race. Now, how do you think Kamala Harris is going to play in the all-important swing states?
Well, I think that's going to animate her decision about who she picks as a running mate. Mm-hmm. I personally have felt ever since this change of ticket that perhaps the strongest candidate for a number of reasons would be Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona. Number one.
That was exactly who I was thinking.
Well, the reason
he's an astronaut.
he's an astronaut, but he's also the husband of Gabby Giffords, who famously was, like Trump, the victim of an assassination attempt. And to some degree, that actually takes away a lot of that bravado from Trump about him, being saved by God and all of this stuff. He's also a guy who the consensus is that he doesn't care about his safe Senate seat, he would be willing to give it up. And he could possibly win Arizona for her. He's popular there. And he's for Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is, like Biden, well down in Arizona. And Mark Kelly would give him a chance. And he also cuts the kind of swath, the kind of image, the kind of cut of his jib is something as a strong white man and astronaut that would appeal to those swing voters of the upper Midwest, specifically Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Now, there's other very good choices, but I find it hard to believe that Gavin Newsom or Josh Shapiro or Gretchen Whitmer, successful, popular, or well-known governors, all of whom likely have their own presidential ambitions, are willing to take a riverboat gamble on being number 2 behind Kamala Harris. That doesn't seem like a very appealing option for governors who have national aspirations.
I think that the final question, Tim, has to be along the lines of the swing state Senate candidates for the Democratic Party were all running well ahead of Joe Biden in terms of the popularity level and perspectives. Do you think that's going to be the same under a nominee, Kamala Harris?
Well, I think those swing state senatorial candidates are going to have to make a decision on whether they want to run as part of the Harris team, so to speak, to run with her or to run apart from her with their own independent campaigns. Because, look, if they cleave themselves to her and she plunges, so will they. If they separate themselves from her, it creates questions about why aren't you in solidarity with Vice President Harris. So it's a tough one to call. But again, I don't think that any of these Senate candidates are going to make any sudden moves.
Yeah, it's not the right time for them to leap out of the box and say, sorry.
I wouldn't if I was running for office. I would not take any kind of a strong position on the Harris candidacy if I was a Democrat until I see more and until she tries to navigate all those questions that we discussed earlier in the show, and there's so many of them.
There's a lot of questions to answer and few answers forthcoming. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
And that's almost all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I've been your host, and our guest today has been longtime host of this here show and Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. I want to thank him for being here, and of course I want to extend my thanks to you, the listeners out there, and the viewers for taking the time to tune in and join us in our conversations. I'd like to leave you with just one thought here. We live in fairly unprecedented times politically. In just the last few weeks, we've witnessed a debate debacle that would have been even unthinkable just a few years ago. We've witnessed the attempted assassination of a former and potentially future president. We've seen the sitting president, after winning his party's primary, be forced out of office in favor of his VP by the very Democrat elites that he warned of and who everybody thought he was one of. And we've seen millions of Democratic Party voters disenfranchised and with no say in who becomes their party's nominee for president. All this is to say that in politics, it seems nothing is off the table and nothing can be taken for granted. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.